right, son.
Welcome, everybody. That's right. You're in for a heck of a show tonight. As actually, tonight is a new launch of my new podcast. We're calling it JB and Friends. I'm so excited about this new opportunity. I know, RC, you're looking at me kind of like, what the hell am I talking about?
Yeah, I didn't get a memo.
You didn't get the memo?
No, I didn't get the memo about the show change.
Oh, all right. Well, geez, that's embarrassing. But tell you what, why don't we go forward anyway, and I'll run things for a while and see how it goes.
All right, run the board for us, JB.
All right, so we got RC here, of course, as usual, and then our good friend Pat. Pat, are you there?
I'm here, and I'm loud and clear, hopefully, for you, our listeners.
Yes, you're coming in nicely. And now, for a super special surprise, we have a friend of the show, all the way out on the West Coast, coming to us from L.A., our good friend, Dan. Dan, say hello to the folks.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this. Very excited.
Tonight, gentlemen, we're going to have the opportunity to talk about the 3 Dark Knight movies by Christopher Nolan. Dark Knight Trilogy, as it's also known as. So I'm going to start off with a basic question. What is your relationship to this series? And I'll start off with RC.
Well, JB, I've had the privilege of seeing, I think, all 3 of these films when they came out in theaters, 2 of which I'm pretty sure I saw with Dan as well. He was part of our viewership, and I know you were there. I mean, growing up, Batman was a large looming figure, from the animated series to the George Clooney and Val Kilmer adaptations. Those certainly were a big part of my childhood, and the action figures that I played with as part of my childhood. So when the Nolan films came along, they, in my opinion, they came in a little bit under the radar. I was not really aware that they were doing a new take on Batman. But then Begins came out, and I know that was instantly adopted to the canon at our house in terms of films that we'd watch regularly, and really set us up for excitement with The Dark Knight when that came out in 2008.
Yeah, similar. I think Batman was the superhero. Like, I grew up with DC Comics more than Marvel Comics. Right? I don't know if that's what the kids these days experience, given the dominance of Marvel movies. But for me, it was DC, especially what is for me still the definitive version of Batman the animated series, which I loved. But I liked I really have enjoyed all the Batman movies. I like the Schumacher Batman movies, ridiculous as they are. I watched those as a kid because I didn't know any better. So yeah, I was very excited for, I think a very similar experience to what you just described, Ryan, where, Batman Begins was there and I was like, oh, that's pretty good. And then Dark Knight came and I was like, wow, like, what are we dealing with here? This is great. I think I saw The Dark Knight like 3 or 4 times in theaters, probably with at least one of you guys back in the day. I remember the Dark Knight was the first movie that I was allowed to drive my car on my own to go and see at like a midnight showing at the mall. So I'll always remember that because it was a big deal that I was allowed to drive by myself, go see this movie. So doubly fond memories for me, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I have a similar relationship. I also saw all those, the Tim Burton Batmans and I believe I saw the George Clooney one with you guys when I was in, I don't know, maybe kindergarten, first, I don't know, whenever that came out. I distinctly recall having a sort of a iron-on graphic T-shirt of that poster. And then I think I also saw the first 2 Christopher Nolan Batman with you 2 as well. And then now that I think about it, the Dark Knight Rises was probably the last franchise film that I saw in theaters. I don't think it was not a concerted effort, but looking back, I think it was probably the last one that I went out of my way to go see in the theater, the weekend that it came out. And I haven't really seen any of the Marvel or DC films that were part of their the MCU and then whatever they call the other one.
All right. Well, that's it's interesting. I mean, it's a nice thing about these movies is because they were such, particularly Dark Knight and Dark Knight Rises, but really Dark Knight was so much events. I think people really do remember going to see them. I happen to remember seeing Dark Knight, and we went to the midnight show back when you could line up and congregate in close quarters, and the theater was totally sold out. Of course, I'm the oldest person sitting in the theater by at least 30 years. Lots of high school kids, college kids, and I mean, just really loud and rambunctious. And I'm thinking, oh man, are these kids going to be quiet during this movie? I want to actually, like an old man, I want to get off my lawn. Well, the Dark Knight starts, and let's just say as soon as the Joker took off his clown mask to show his face, there was total silence in that theater for the rest of the movie. I mean, Heath Ledger's appearance to the Joker had that kind of impact on even high school kids. I mean, it was an awesome experience from that perspective. And I really enjoyed Batman Begins, and I really love this series. I have to say that. We have a question here: how many times have you seen these films? I couldn't count. I mean, if they're on, I'm hard pressed to go buy them. And I think I have more of an appreciation now for them than I did even when they came out. So, if we had to sort of estimate how many times, Pat, would you say you've seen these movies?
I also couldn't tell you. Although I haven't, this is another one like Inception that I feel like I watched like very intently many times, the movies from this series, at least the first two, but then haven't watched since probably like 2015, 2016, at least watched intently enough for me to log it in Letterboxd. So it's been a while. It was nice to revisit them.
RC?
Yeah, similar to Pat. I think it's been a while. I don't think I can remember watching The Dark Knight Rises after it came out of theaters. I must have at least once, but I recently revisited Begins and The Dark Knight sometime last year. Was entertained by them, but it's handful of times. I'm not an avid. I like the film, so.
Dan?
Similarly, I've only seen Dark Knight Rises in theaters the one time I saw it, but the other two, I have a slight preference for Batman Begins. So I've seen that one probably maybe 4 times, and from start to finish while paying complete attention. But I don't know how many times I've seen The Dark Knight, but definitely the first one was my favorite. So that's the one that I will make time to watch it.
All right, Batman Begins. That's your favorite of the 3. Okay, so why don't we go into the origin of how we got to Nolan's Batman and Dark Knight? Clearly, there had been other iterations of Batman, as we talked about in the intro here, and some of them very good, some of them not so good. And Joel Schumacher was mentioned, and as a matter of fact, he was in talks to do a reboot of Batman and had gotten down pretty far to discussions. And then Christopher Nolan, who had just finished coming off a movie called Insomnia, starring Al Pacino and Robin Williams, which he was distributed by Warner, he heard about the fact that they were looking to reboot Batman, and he said, well, maybe I'll go over and talk to these guys and see if I can tell them what my thoughts might be. And the reality was that at that point back in, let's say, 2004, there never really been a true origin story movie about Batman. Various parts of his history were shown on screen in the comic books, but there were various parts of his earlier life that were never really touched on. And so Nolan was intrigued by that, about the duality of the character and what gave rise to somebody like this who comes from privilege and that kind of thing. In a tragedy in his early life, losing his parents. So he kind of pitched the concept to the Warner's guys, and they said, yeah, fine, we're interested, but come back to us when you actually have a script or something we can actually, execute on, or at least, refer to. So, with that in mind, he decided to get started on it. And obviously, he's a screenwriter of well regard, and he reached out to David Goyer, who, as luck would have it, is a huge Batman Bruce Wayne fan from the time he was a little kid, and he always wanted to actually do and write a Batman story and do a movie. And so Nolan said, "Well, why don't you join me and let's do this thing?" And at the time, Goyer had a couple other projects he was working on, and said, "Geez, Chris, I don't think I can do it. I'm tied up otherwise." And he said, but you know what? I'll give you a few ideas, spitball for free. No, I don't need to be credited or anything, but I'd really like to see you do this thing. So he started, and then before he knew it, he basically got sucked in by Nolan, and he was sitting in Nolan's garage, which is where they wrote this thing, putting up storyboards and working on a script and what have you. And so they were really making great progress. And then Nolan reached out to another friend of his, a fellow named Nathan Crowley, who is the production designer on the Dark Knight series. And Nolan really wanted to get his input early on in what they were doing because he thought that, his input about how this thing was going to look would be very important. So he too came to the garage out in LA, and the three of them sat and basically literally sweat equity, because there was no air conditioning out there, as Goyer puts it. And he worked on this thing. And the funny part, Goyer said, he goes, there was some funny parts, issues going back and forth. He said, but every other Wednesday we had to vacate that area because that's where the washer dryers were. And the cleaning people for Nolan would come in and have to use the washer and dryer, and we couldn't concentrate. So we had to go somewhere else to write on that day. So, as they progressed with things, they really felt they started to have something special. And, but Nolan is very secretive. He's very concerned about stuff leaking out and people finding out about his ideas. So all of the information as they were building the storyboards and the script and such, they filed under a name called Intimidation Game. So they had no reference to Batman Begins, or any of the characters or anything like that, because he was very afraid that somehow it would leak out in advance of him having all the pieces together, and he did not want to have sort of a partially baked thing out there in front of anybody. So it's also interesting because we obviously refer to this now as a trilogy. Nolan said that from day one, he and Goyer basically had an outline for how they thought the whole thing would go. But because he's superstitious, he didn't want to jinx it. And he said, we can't get caught up with that because we might leave something in the tank on Begins. So he just said, all right, let's just focus on Begins and we'll see where that, takes us. When it came time, they had the draft of the script in a position where Nolan felt he wanted to, reach out to the studio. He did. And he said to those guys, you got to come over to my garage and read it, because I'm not going to send out any copies. So these guys, Goyer said, these executives, they're wearing, business casual, whatever. And it's hot as hell in there. And they're sitting there for a couple of hours reading the script, but they loved it. The Warner executives were like, this is great. We want to go with this. So he was really happy with the fact that he had a script that he thought he could work with, and Goyer was happy with it. And Crowley, the set designer, basically felt he had a good idea of what the look of this thing was going to be. Now, of course, it came to casting, right? Who we're going to cast in these roles. And so first and foremost, of course, is Bruce Wayne, Batman. Nolan said he had seen Christian Bale's work. Obviously, he had worked for him in Prestige, and he said he was the first choice. There was no question in his mind that was the guy he wanted to be his Bruce Wayne. And apparently it was not a long conversation. I guess Bale said, yeah, I want to do it, and let's go. And so he was the first to be cast as obviously Bruce Wayne. And then, but the interesting thing about Bale at that time is, obviously right now we all recognize him as one of the great actors in the current generation, but he was coming off a movie called The Machinist in 2004, where he plays a character that, as part of his depression and everything else that's going on in his life, he loses 60 pounds. So Bale got down to being the method guy. He got down to like 135 pounds or 125 pounds for this role. I mean, if you've seen the movie, it's unbelievable that it's not CGI, but that's actually him. I was doing some research, though. I found out something pretty interesting, that the fellow who wrote the script for Machinist, a fellow named Ricky Camilleri, and as a writer, he was trying to inject himself somewhat into the situation. And so when he was talking about these weights and all the weight loss and stuff, he used himself as an example. Only problem is he's 5'6". So when he plugged in these weights in terms of how much weight he had to lose and what have you, he was basically, for a guy who was 5'6". A guy for a guy 5'6", 135 pounds, 125 pounds. That's not really, I mean, it's a thin guy. It's not a totally emaciated person. So he forgot, they forgot that Bale was 6 feet tall. So in pre-production, the director, Brad Anderson, gets pulled aside by Camilleri, and he goes, hey, listen, tell Christian that he doesn't have to lose this much weight because he's 6 feet tall. I'm 5'6". We got to adjust the math. So Anderson says, hey, Christian, look, maybe instead of 60 pounds, maybe you lose 25 or 30. And Bale goes, no, I really like to try to do the whole thing, see if I can do it. So he goes ahead and, in fact, he accomplishes what he said he was going to accomplish. So, but now, of course, when it comes to Batman, Nolan says, look, you're going to have to put on some weight, get yourself ready to play the role. He goes, don't worry about it. I'll take care of it. Well, he got himself into a program, started lifting heavy weights, started doing a lot of the martial arts training, the system they call KFM, which was invented in Spain in the late 50s. It was close quarter combat, multi-assailant type of fighting. And Bale got up to 225 pounds, which in one way was terrific because he's physically a dominant looking guy. And it worked out well for the early scenes when he's training with Ra's al Ghul and Liam Neeson's character. But Nolan was like, he's not going to fit into the bat suit. He's too big. And the crew started calling him Fat Man. So he had to back off on his training and do a lot more aerobic and fight training and less heavy lifting. So they were concerned that he would not necessarily, fit into the suit. So that's kind of an interesting turnaround to go from 125 pounds in your last movie to 225 pounds in this movie. So I don't know if anybody else has anything to add on the choice of Christian Bale.
No, I think it's great, but that's like become a signature thing. I think all of us across the rest of his filmographies, he seems to yo-yo. I think he's decided that because there's like serious health implications to constantly going between 175 pounds and 260 pounds to play Dick Cheney, that probably the last time he does a major weight gain was for that movie Vice that he did. Because prior to that, he had done another major weight loss coming off the Batman, in between Batman movies for The Fighter, the David O. Russell
in
film.
American Hustle, he put on a belly again.
He's a psychopath. He clearly just needs something to do. Well,
the irony there too is that with the Vice thing was before he got Vice, there was a movie going around which was going to be the biopic of Enzo Ferrari, and they wanted Christian Bale to play Enzo Ferrari, and Bale said, well, no, I have to gain too much weight to be him. I'm not going to do it. And then, of course, Vice comes along and he goes, oh, I'll do this instead.
And they lost weight again to being Ford versus Ferrari.
Right.
So
Ford versus Ferrari.
He's a total maniac.
So the other actor that was high on Nolan's list was Cillian Murphy, who we know from Peaky Blinders and obviously know from the series. He played Dr. Crane in Scarecrow. And Nolan really admired his work on 28 Days and brought him in for a screen test and had him do a screen test for Bruce Wayne. Nolan said he did a great job, but obviously he was committed to Bale, and he was like, that was going to be, his guy. But he said he liked him so much. He said, we'll cast him for, Dr. Crane. And he thought he'd be great, which is Scarecrow, which of course he was. One of the things Nolan said that he was concerned about as he was putting this great cast together is he wanted to make sure that in the script, which is obviously a lot of action in all these scripts, that there was an opportunity for these actors to find little small moments to actually do their thing, that they had some room to feel like they had, enough gravitas in this film, that it wasn't just all about, pauses between action, and it was actually all part of a story arc. So, I think it's pretty clear that he accomplishes that in these films. So, obviously Christopher Nolan, we look back on it now and say it's a no-brainer for him to do these films. But back then, when you look at his credits, he only had 3 directorial credits before he got Batman Begins. He had done Memento, the following Memento, and then previously mentioned Insomnia. So when you think about it, the executives at Warner were taking a huge gamble on this young guy to reboot one of their, basically flagship franchises. And obviously it worked out. But when you think about it, there were a lot of other named directors that were all waiting to, have an opportunity at this project, but they gave it to Christopher Nolan. And I don't think there's any regrets about that based on how things have turned out. So in terms of the writing, obviously he co-wrote this with also his brother, Jonathan. David Goyer gets the story credit. And David Goyer, at this point in time, his prior claims to fame were that he basically wrote the Blade trilogy, starring the IRS tax advocate Wesley Snipes. If you recall that, if you saw any Blade series.
Those were early 2000, right? Those were that sort of Marvel's kind of was spread out all over the place because of issues with the bankruptcies and stuff. And that was one of those ones that got picked up.
And actually, in one of the films, either Blade 2 or Blade 3, a young Ryan Reynolds appears.
Oh, I've never seen the Blade movies. Maybe that's something I need to do.
Maybe not, but
okay.
The terrific editor Lee Smith is on these films. He, prior to collaborating with Nolan, he had worked with Peter Weir on his films, and he most notably he was nominated for 5 Oscars for Best Picture, and he's credited as film editor on Master Commander, which is a terrific movie back in 2002 starring Russell Crowe. He also worked on Inception and Dunkirk, so really super talented fellow. Nathan Crowley, I mentioned earlier, was on the production design here and has worked with Nolan on Interstellar, as well as Dark Knight, Dunkirk. So he's, Nolan seems to have his team of guys that he likes to keep around him and work with consistently, which is...
That seems to be what most efficient directors that turn stuff... Nolan's not really an efficient director in terms of how much he's churning stuff, but most guys, I mean, even Spielberg seems to work with basically the same people
Eastwood's
since the
done
early
that.
90s.
He did that for decades.
Yeah.
Clint's just outlived all those guys, basically. So, and obviously, we can go down the cast. I mean, the cast here, these 3 movies,
it's absurd. I mean,
it's unbelievable.
We got Christian Bale, Michael Caine, Gary Oldman, Morgan Freeman, Liam Neeson. I'm just going to like the top tier. Obviously, Aaron Eckhart, Cillian Murphy, Heath Ledger. Then, I mean, you have 2 Rachels, you have Katie Holmes and Maggie Gyllenhaal. So you have both sides of that, whatever side we come down on later about that. Rucker Hauer's in this film, which I didn't even realize first 3 times. So I watched the Batman Begins. Ledger's great. I like your note here. Eric Roberts was in What Does It Matter What He was in before this. He was pretty good though. He's very much cast in type here. And then to varying effects, you have Joseph Gordon-Levitt, Anne Hathaway, Marion Cotillard, and Tom Hardy come in for the final installment, as well as Matthew Modine, who I don't usually care for, but he was all right here. I'll do quick notes on box office, and then just you can finish us up with some production history and some other notes you've found in your research. So Batman Begins was released December 15th, 2005. Budget was $150 million, which that seems wild to me that they gave him this much money for the first film. And I guess it makes sense, but I don't know if I fully saw that. I don't know. It didn't seem like that was that big of a scale, but I guess when you're doing everything practically, you got to shell out a lot of cash to have bodies. And then gross for the United States was $206 million. So it made back its money in the US, and that's without print and advertising. And then cumulative worldwide, is this right? $373 million. So relatively modest sum it made back.
I thought it was a little higher than that too. I thought it was like 500 million, but that's the number I saw. So I went with a conservative number, but I thought it was higher too.
Yeah. And then we have 3 years later, we have Dark Knight comes out July 20th, 2008, $185 million budget, which every cent of that you can see on screen. Gross $533.5 million for the USA, and cumulative worldwide gross of over $1 billion. Then finally Rises comes 4 years later, July 22nd, 2012, budget now it's jumbo supersized $250 million, which is a Marvel size budget there, Avengers size budget. US gross was $448 million and $1.08 billion with a B $billion worldwide. So
these were the first big $1 billion grossers, right? Like I remember now it's like, how many movies are going to gross $1 billion? But I remember when that meant something, and that was around the time that these movies were made.
I think Alice in Wonderland, one of the years that we're talking, it was the same year as Inception. Alice in Wonderland made $1 billion.
Yeah, 2010. Yeah.
It's wild. It is absolutely wild how that's all changed, and all the money seems to consolidate around these tent poles more so now than ever. But I guess this is kind of the movement towards it, and this made these type of tent poles seem very serious.
I think this was the first time really that people were critically looking at quote unquote a comic book movie and giving it the kind of accolades that more serious fare was previously we were getting. This is sort of like setting a new standard, and from a critical point of view, I think. So a little bit of production history and trivia here. Nolan had not, previous to this, had not really done any kind of big scale action film. So, among the things he was looking at was obviously in Begins and Dark Knight and Dark Knight Rises, there's all sorts of auto stuff, different versions of car chases, you could call them. So he looked this up, he did research, and he found that the average car chase in the film is 4 minutes long, which he said, geez, it seems like a lot shorter than they seem when you're watching them. They seem like they go on forever. Now, of course, the famous one in Bullet goes on for almost 14 minutes, but that's above average apparently. And he said, he very much tried to approach all his work, but particularly these films, from an audience perspective. What does the audience want to see from me and see from these characters? The other thing he was concerned about is how long does it take before the hero puts on his cape? He said because he doesn't want the audience just kind of like yawning through the earlier stuff and backstory and all the other things he's trying to put together if they're just waiting for Batman to put on the cape. So he checked it out and basically decided that he had a pretty good idea from Dick Donner's Superman films, which he really admired. So when they were reading the script, I guess afterwards, one of the executives brought up the fact that, Chris, it doesn't look like Bruce Wayne becomes Batman until an hour into the movie. That seems like that's a little long, don't you think? And so he shoots back. Nolan says, he goes, well, Dick Donner didn't have Greaves in his cape until the 55-minute mark in Superman. They're like, oh, really? Oh, yeah, really? And it all backed off. And then Nolan said he had no idea whether that was right or not, but he was just like, he wasn't going to debate with these guys about, rewriting a script because a few minutes earlier, they wanted him to be Batman to be in his cape. So Nolan is a huge, huge proponent of IMAX. He loves IMAX. And he believes that that's the best way to particularly see these big sort of tentpole type pictures. He said there's nothing like it. And so Batman Begins, there were just a few scenes that were shot in IMAX. By Dark Knight, most of it was shot in IMAX. And when it came to Dark Knight Rises, it was pretty much almost all of it was shot in IMAX. So he really likes that format. He thinks the big screen and the sound is just, and of course he's still a huge advocate for film. He's not a big digital guy in terms of, original productions being put on digital. And along the way, I found out that he took it on himself. I don't think he got paid for this. He took it on himself to do a complete remastering of 2001 Space Odyssey to be able to put it on IMAX format.
I'm sure Stanley Kubrick's estate really appreciated that.
I don't know. I'm not sure how he got to that or how it came about, but and a matter of fact, when it came to do the last film, Dark Knight Rises, he actually went down to IMAX and sat and watched the first two films with them and said, look, I really like you to lend me all your cameras so I can, get this thing done in a most cost efficient manner. So anyway, that's a little bit of the backstory here about these three films. I think if you're fans, and you probably have heard some of this stuff before, one of the things that we've attached to, we will attach to this posting is an interview that was done with Nolan. Actually, last March, at the end of last March, they had a celebration of Batman because Batman turned 80 years old last year, and Nolan was interviewed because they did a back display of these movies at City Walk, and it's about a half-hour interview, but it's pretty interesting about his thoughts about the film, and he said that he has no desire to go back, and he said it was a great 10-year run, and he said he wishes nothing but the best for people going forward, but that he's really not interested in revisiting the characters or the stories.
Yeah. And those are Nolan's thoughts. But if you want to stay tuned for the thoughts of the four minds here, we're going to dip the break. And when we come back, we will discuss the
Please
big,
come
the
back
small.
to our initial podcast, JB and Friends.
All right. Stick around. Welcome back in as we continue to discuss the Dark Knight Trilogy. I'm going to take the wheel for a little while here and steer our discussion as we go forward. So as always, we like to just put a couple markers down for maybe who has influenced this series of films and who has influenced the director here. I know there's a pretty easy through line here of note. So JB, tell us a little bit about who Nolan cited.
Well, Nolan said with these three films, basically he really admired Dick Donner Superman's films. He thought he did a really terrific job with the characters there and how he laid that all out. And then for particularly Dark Knight, which he viewed as more of a crime story as opposed to anything else, he heavily influenced by Michael Mann, which I think you can see. If you looked at the movie Heat, the heist sequence and stuff is not too dissimilar from what the opening part of Dark Knight is about, which is a heist, obviously. And then as a youngster, Nolan said he loved the Bond films, and I think you can see a little bit of that with Mike, with Morgan Freeman's character being sort of a Q type character. You got Alfred kind of being a combination of M and Moneypenny sort of thing, and Commissioner Gordon. So I think there's a lot of Bond-isms sort of in the Dark Knight trilogy.
That's very interesting. And Pat, I think the other one probably is film noir. I don't know specifically, but do you sense that sort of running as an undercurrent through these as well?
Yeah, definitely. Certainly in the way that they're composed visually. Anytime that Batman is in full Batman mode and he's in the shadows, like a lot of the high angle work, a lot of just like the predominance of shadow and the depth of field is very evocative of film noir, and as is the whole detective story. The crooked cops, the detective story aspects of it. Probably more Michael Mann, but still nods to the deep, 1940s film noir.
Yeah, that sort of lighting and moral ambiguity and that kind of grounding there, but with the slick camera angles and chase sequences of a Michael Mann film. We'll talk more about Nolan later. So we're going to do a little narrative discussion. First, we're going to go micro. We're going to go quickly film by film, and then we're going to talk macro about narrative in the entire series before we move on to just a couple technical notes. So Dan is actually a writer, so I wanted to get his take on just sort of how tentpole films are usually structured, and sort of what the expectation generally is for a film like this. And then maybe we can talk more specifically about how some of these films either break those rules or bend them. So Dan, I'll let you talk about that.
Sure. So most, Hollywood films follow a 3-act structure, or can be sort of analyzed in a 3-act structure format, which basically has a couple key elements. In the first act, you're going to have generally you establish a lot of exposition. You establish sort of the world and the character, and then there's some sort of moments referred to as like the inciting incident that acts upon the character and sort of shakes them out of their normal routine. And it is generally pushing them towards a decision that they will make by the end of Act 1 to basically pursue or become involved in the story that you're going to follow for Acts 2 and 3. And the second act, which is the longest act, is often like broken into 2 parts. So, Act 2A and Act 2B. And generally in that first half of the second act, your protagonist is going to be facing sort of an escalating series of obstacles or challenges. And basically they are testing the character and sort of challenging them along one of their main weaknesses. And the idea being that they're given just a little bit more than they can handle at each obstacle. And then they hit the midpoint of the film, which is when the character, it's a second plot point, where the character goes from being more of a reactive entity to sort of acting in the second half of the second act. And that second act usually ends with another plot point where they are thrust into sort of almost the point of no return. In like Star Wars, it's when they get, sucked into the Death Star, and they're pretty much, they're either going to follow through and succeed, or they're going to fail and die. So it's a pretty, it's a low one. And then pretty quickly in the third act, you're going to want to have a resolution, is sort of the climax of the film, which is followed by a sort of return to the new status quo for this character. And you can track these changes in 2 parts. The first is basically what your character's sort of surface level problem is. For one, Jaws. In Jaws, Chief Brody's main problem is that there's a shark that is eating people on the island that he's in charge of. But he has a personal problem, which is that he is afraid of the water. And so as a writer, you are trying to use your world and the story to challenge your character so that if they meet the external challenge, it will force them to change internally or face their internal fears. In this case, Chief Brody, to kill the shark, must get in the water and overcome his sort of city boy mentality and fear of water. And that is a pretty constant theme across, all Hollywood films.
That's the framework, obviously, to your point about broad strokes, it's sort of a framework that works across any type of genre for more or less any type of stories. And there are alternate story structures, but that has seemed to be the one that American cinema largely has settled on over the past 50 years. So to that point, let's talk a little bit about the script and Begins, because Batman Begins seems to follow this almost to a T in terms of how the act structure works, to Dan's point about Act 1 really being about the development of Bruce Wayne up to the point where he leaves and returns to Gotham, sort of all juxtaposed together in one single act. And then there's a return to Gotham. There's his sort of discovery of like the Scarecrow and everything that's going on there. And then there's the revelation about Ra's al Ghul. So Pat, for you, what works in this Batman Begins script?
I like the ninja stuff, simply put. That's a cool, JB, you were on the money talking about, we'd never seen the ninja stuff with a live action Batman before. And it's cool. It really I guess it puts a pretty clear boundary around the first act. And is like a cool introduction. It allows you to see Batman make choices that develop his personal philosophy. And also, how he is a cool, badass ninja. So win-win there, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think seeing the background, and Nolan seems to love the crosscut. There's a good video, and I've seen it in every video essay I've watched about Christopher Nolan, where he draws a diagram of how his stories work. And I think it was in reference to Memento, but he basically puts two lines on different areas of the chalkboard and then draws sort of an arc between them and shows that the 2 points are the two story points that he's going to be cutting constantly back and forth between. They're different points in time. And the top of the arc is where the movies or the act's going to end. And that's clear here too. And Dark Knight Rises or Batman Begins, because throughout the whole first act, you're peppered with Bruce as a boy, Bruce growing up, and then Bruce gaining the skills to come back to Gotham and become Batman. And I think it works really efficiently. And I will just comment that I was able to watch just films of that era. So like Iron Man, Spider-Man, and X-Men, I watched all of them. And, there's a lot of differences between those films in terms of tone and what they're trying to do. But one of the biggest ones was how efficiently and interestingly Batman Begins deals with that sort of origin of him getting the skill set that he needed. I thought it did it most effectively and most dramatically of anything, of any of those type of films that were coming out in that era, and clearly has inspired a lot of things since then. Let's talk a little bit about what are some of like the comic book stuff and what has been sort of grounded and placed in a more realistic frame here.
For me, I think this is Batman Begins is the most comic booky of these movies, because maybe it's studio notes, maybe it's Nolan not ready to take the steps that he would take with the sequels, sort of do his own thing with these things, but it's like more grounded in, exactly Tobey Maguire Spider-Man and X-Men and the in parallel release the same year Iron Man movie, the Iron Man origin story. So I think it extends beyond that. I think the production design, like the monorail, which never shows up in any of the sequels, whereas the sequels are like very clearly crime dramas. Like that monorail would fit into the Burton or Schumacher Batman universes. The color, there's a lot more color. Well, there's not a lot of color in any of these movies, but there's more color and like sort of vividness, I think, to the photography in Batman Begins than in either of the films that follow it. And I think there's sort of an exaggerated physics, especially like the Narrows, where much of the climax takes place, or like the bar where Falcone, the whole elevated train way or tram or highway, whatever that is. it has a very like comic booky physicality, like a bigness to it, that is less grounded than a lot of what follows. So like those things the production design feels very comic booky to me. I don't know. What do you guys think compared to some of these other films and maybe even just the run-of-the-mill Marvel film these days?
Yeah, I'd actually like to hear Dan's opinion because I know he's not a big superhero guy. So I'd like to hear his thoughts on sort of how those films evolve even visually for him in terms of plot points and then also the visual design.
Yeah, I mean, I think this was touched on earlier, but this is the especially Batman Begins. It's not like story that is there so that basically the action makes sense, which is how some films, superhero films, feel to me, where it's like, there's a story because it can't all be 2 hours of set pieces, and that can get kind of boring. In the the Christopher Nolan Batman films, I think the reason I enjoy them is because it's a film that has, scenes that call for action, and it's totally in service of the story and in service of, the characters' arcs. And you feel, that's what makes it feel like a film to me versus like, a roller coaster ride that some of the superhero films that I'm not as into, I felt like when I see them. So that's sort of my like, macro view of all three of those films.
Yeah, it is. It is interesting because I'd like to get that into this more in a little bit, but just how much of a writer Nolan is, and clearly to your point about story structure and act structure and just structuring something in general, how meticulous he is and how much of a perfectionist he is, and trying to get that to drive people and drive your emotions versus like what you said, a lot of times in other lesser films, you're right. The plot is paper thin, and it's just a string basically to hang events on so they can go from piece to piece and spectacle to spectacle. JB, you're very fond of this film. Do you have any other, what other thoughts you have about sort of the narrative and the setup? And is this maybe the best sort of origin story for a superhero?
Yeah, it's the best.
Without hesitation.
It was the first, and I think it's the best. I think the only other one that's in the ballpark, in my opinion, with this is the Captain America First Avenger.
You're very fond of that.
I do. I like that. I think that's the only one. That's the only one I think is close to this one.
What was that, Pat?
I like that movie. I hardly second that opinion. I like Captain America: The First Avenger, and I think they do a similarly good job of setting up, puny Steve Rogers. Anyway.
Yeah, no, it was interesting because I literally just finished Iron Man before we got on this call for the podcast, and to me, to Dan's point, that was like the biggest thing is because those are probably the two most similar characters, right? Batman in the DC universe and Tony Stark in the Marvel universe. In a way, I know personality types are a little bit different, but they're billionaires who have
they're regular guys.
Yeah, right.
I mean, regular guys in the sense that they don't have superpowers
they don't actually
themselves.
have a superpower. They have
all the other characters in these universes have something that's happened to them or not of this world.
Yeah,
these are basically two regular guys,
right, that
have found a way to fight crime and do things.
Yeah, but it's just like such a contrast in how sort of flimsy and showy that movie is, and its attempt to entertain versus this, and trying to ground and sort of conjure up that idea of somebody overcoming trauma and using fear to motivate, where Tony Stark doesn't really, you only get so much of the psychology of the character there, even though there is sort of like a similar background. There's issues with the father, blah, blah, blah. So I just thought that was very interesting.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say a thing that, we haven't talked about, I don't think, is like the relationship between characters. Yeah. Which I think are very strong in the Christopher Nolan Batman films. And like I said, I haven't seen a lot of the other Marvel films, but so I guess it would be posing a question to you guys if there are relationships between other characters that rise to what I think are pretty compelling relationships between, Bruce Wayne and Alfred, and Bruce Wayne and why am I blanking on Morgan Freeman's character's name?
Lucius
Fox.
Fox.
Yeah. Thank you. Which I think are like, I would say certainly among the stronger parts of that film are those respective relationships. So I was wondering if A, you agreed, and B, if you thought, and also his relationships with the villains. They're not just purely there's a rationale, there's a dynamic to them that I think is like more than just sort of good versus bad, which I guess I'm wondering if that is matched by any of the other superhero films.
Yeah. And Pat, I just have a quick comment before you might have one, but I do remember watching the second part of the Avengers movie in theaters, and there's a moment towards the end where there's a big death, and I remember somebody in the theater started crying hysterically, and I just started laughing. I was like, how can you like to Dan's point, how can you care this much about the characters? Whereas in these films, I was feeling, even as we were rewatching them, knowing what was going to happen, I felt more of an emotional impact, especially in Dark Knight when, you have the scene with Rachel again. That hit harder for me than anything that happened in the Marvel films, just because I think the stakes are also different in terms of what they do. Pat, I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that these movies are stronger, and I think if you're looking for character, this is the place to be, not over in the MCU. Because I think there's two things. One, like, I actually think that what this movie shares with the MCU is what the MCU gets sort of accused of, and rightfully so, is that the villain in the origin story is just the hero with the same powers that's evil. Huh. And in Iron Man, it's Jeff Bridges in a, knockoff Iron Man armor, and Captain America, it's a guy who took the same serum, and Thor is his brother Loki, and so on and so forth. That these guys end up basically fighting themselves but evil, which is fine. I think like Ra's al Ghul, maybe not so much the Joker, but like somebody like Ra's al Ghul in this movie, in Batman Begins, is very clearly like Batman, but sort of with an evil agenda and like a different. You just twist a few parts of his worldview, and you get Ra's al Ghul. So I think it's used. I think it can be used well or poorly. Here it's used great. And then I think the other thing, like, this movie establishes the relate. Like, you feel for Alfred Pennyworth, and like from this first movie, what his relationship, what these characters' relationships are, and like the depth of the bond between Batman and Alfred, and Batman and Rachel, and even Rachel and you understand that. Whereas I think with the Avengers movies, the bond is a lot more tenuous, and it's like it's different. It's like, oh, they're so cool. It's more aspirational, and how you like identify with the character and identify with all of the experience of seeing them over time. And, I think it's more about that, whereas this is a very traditional, solid, foundational narrative relationship, driven picture.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And they certainly get all the pieces in place in Batman Begins to sort of expand the world from there. So let's pivot into Dark Knight. And I, doing a little bit of reading and watching surrounding the Dark Knight, and something that didn't occur to me at the time was how in certain ways the Dark Knight really addresses sort of some of the fears that had lingered from 9/11, and how more broadly superhero movies sort of maybe became popular in the modern psyche because of that idea that we wish that there was somebody there who was always on the watchtower who could stop bad things from happening. But this seemed to really sort of dive into the nihilism and the sort of irrationality from our viewpoint of everything that happened in 9/11 and what was going on there. Do you think, could you see the same reading of this? And do you think that's a effective lens to even view this movie through? Dan, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always interested in, what was going on at the time that something was written or filmed, and how it relates to what was, produced. Like, I think that's, for instance, I was talking to somebody about this the other day. That's why, like, Inherent Vice didn't land for me as much as, like The Long Goodbye, which are very similar films. Mm-hmm. And it's I just felt like, Long Goodbye was definitely a product of its time, and what everybody involved in that film is experiencing is sort of seeping into the final product. Whereas Inherent Vice, which I enjoyed, it rang a little bit more hollow, and so I'm always interested in that. And I'd buy the idea that this is certainly intentionally or not reflective of sort of the collective seeking of order and, logic in someone to sort of reassure us that, the world is not ending. I mean, I think that's definitely part of the appeal of these films. I mean, there's a reason that these characters have been around for a long, long time. And, it's probably not a total coincidence that they exploded in popularity as films, in the immediate aftermath of like the most traumatic event since, like Pearl Harbor. So I buy that.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting. And just like the Joker as a character, let's talk about the Joker as a character and sort of his philosophy. I think Pat, you put here about the Alfred's weird story about, him saying sometimes men just want to watch the world burn. And I think it is sort of an odd comment, but it's interesting how the plot works to make it so that Batman's escalated this war with the mob so much that they're desperate, and out of their desperation, they go to somebody who they don't really understand, and they don't understand how they function. And no one can seem to wrap their head around what the Joker's doing. And that's, I think, what makes him all the more terrifying, because of that. And that character really seems to drive this movie forward at like a Formula One car. And you just kind of are whipping around turns and not really knowing what the rest of the track looks like. So I think the Joker is very, very interesting here. Pat, now besides Ledger's performance, like what are your thoughts on this portrayal of the Joker? There's been many over the years. Yeah,
he's definitely probably, I don't know, this is contention for either my top or second most favorite Joker portrayal over the years. Obviously, number one is Jared Leto in whatever they're doing these days. But he's so elemental, he just is chaos. And I think too often, maybe not too often, but sometimes directors, no one included, feel like they need to tell us too much about a character. Maybe this is what you're all saying. And we know, nothing of the Joker's background, and we never find out, even though he uses the sort of suggestion of his background to great effect. He's so elemental. I don't know. That's the easiest way to describe it is he's not a key character so much as he is a force.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it definitely is. I think it's also the other interesting thing in this movie is he is the force of nature, which everybody is sort of coming up against. But they also present sort of I don't know exactly how you describe him, but Harvey Dent's like the light version of Bruce Wayne in terms of they have the whole line about the hero that Gotham deserves versus the hero that it needs. But it is interesting that they set up another central character whose arc is more pronounced than anybody else in the film. Like you could make an argument that he, in a lot of ways, is the sort of central arc of the entire movie, right? That Harvey Dent and his turn is what the movie is about. I wonder, is it convincing to you guys sort of how he turns in that final act, or does that leave some questions? JB, do you have any thoughts on that?
On Harvey Two-Face?
On Harvey Two-Face.
Well, if you had what Harvey Dent had to deal with, I suppose that could at least ruin your day, maybe your weekend, when half your face is burnt off, and you listen to your girlfriend have to get blown up, and then you believe that people that you were counting on rescued you instead of your girlfriend. I think you could probably be a little upset, and I think part of the Joker's mission here is not only to cause chaos, but is to corrupt and is to change these people who are otherwise normally law-abiding citizens into animals. And that's what the whole setup on the ferry is about, right? Because you have one ship of, not fools, but you have one ship of criminals. And you got another ship of regular commuters just trying to get home, right? And so the Joker sets up a proposition, basically says, I'm convinced that one or the other is going to blow up the other, so they're going to become murderers one way or another. I mean, the guys who are prisoners have already done bad stuff, so odds are they're probably going to be pretty quick to press the detonator, at least the Joker thinks. And then the other side of it, he says, hey, listen, these good citizens, if it comes down to it, they'll commit heinous acts of violence if it's in their best interest. He himself is uncorruptible because he's basically pure evil. He doesn't have a price. He's, as Alfred said, some women watch the world burn. When he burns all the money that he takes from the mob guys and basically says, I'm just burning my half, and he burns it all up. Mm. How do you defend? How do you go at somebody like that? And then in the final sort of showdown with Batman, basically to talk about, and they go back and forth, and Joker says, in essence, I don't want to kill you. You're too much fun. He said, and he's basically like, out of some sense of loyalty and some sense of code, you can't kill, but yet these other people would do it in a minute, and so I think it's the Joker represents a lot of, I think, things that were going on in our post 9/11 world about people who wanted to kill us and hurt us, and we don't really understand why. Ultimately, we really don't understand why they're motivated to do it in such a fashion where they don't care whether it's innocent people or not. If they can hurt us, they're going to hurt us.
Yeah. I think the other thing that was interesting is there's the line in there about schemers, I think.
Gordon, the schemers.
But I would like to just bring up the point that this man is orchestrating massive terror attacks. He's clearly a schemer. Like, isn't that line's kind of full of shit, right? Like,
yeah, I think so.
He's like talking out of two sides of his mouth there.
I'm like, I'm like a dog that chases an ambulance. I wouldn't know what to do when I got it.
I also noticed with the dog, there's 3 instances of like the dogs at the beginning, the mention of dogs, and then the dogs at the end, which I thought was interesting because it kind of ties the character of the Joker together as a mad dog throughout the thing. Let's Pat, you had a question here. Why don't you pose that to us? I want to kick that around.
To me, this film is more crime thriller than it is superhero movie. And I think that's why it sort of transcends, one of the reasons why it transcends. What do you guys like? Is this a superhero movie? Is this a crime thriller? Like how would we even classify this within genre?
Dan?
I mean, I typically look at most films as character studies. They're classified as one or not. And I tend to, when I think of this film, think of the, sort of character study of this guy, Bruce Wayne. But I guess between those two choices, I would probably say a crime thriller. I mean, I think it has both the feel and some of the story elements, or more aligns more closely with the crime thriller. But I'm also interested to hear what you guys have to say, because I actually have not thought of this question before.
JB, I want your thoughts, and I want to circle back with Dan on something.
Yeah, I would say it's it's a sort of got the trappings of a crime thriller with the overlay of these characters who are comic book legends, if you will. But the way Batman Begins sets us up, by the time we get into Dark Knight, we know a hell of a lot more about Bruce Wayne and Batman than we obviously did before Batman Begins. And then the good news, bad news is, we know nothing about who the Joker really is, in terms of what his real name was or where he came from or anything about that. And to me, that adds to the fear and the terror, because you don't have any idea who your enemy is. Why is this person doing this? Why all of a sudden is he come out of nowhere to lead this attempt to basically cause chaos in Gotham City?
So Dan, you mentioned the sort of the character study aspect, and I know I just mentioned the sort of Harvey Dent angle of it. Do you think out of these 3 films, is this has to be the least focused on the actual Bruce Wayne character's development, right?
Well, I mean, I think, I remember a moment that stood out to me when I watched it the first time was definitely when he throws all the guests out of his party when he's very obnoxious. Mm-hmm. And I remember thinking like, oh, wow, that was like a really interesting use of the sort of Bruce Wayne backstory. We all know about him being sort of a rich, well-off guy, because he was making a clear choice to sort of harm his reputation and his sort of image in the eyes of others in order to protect others. And those types of choices that are like really testing a character more so than, whether they can knock somebody off of a ledge, with their human strength. And so, that one always jumped out to me, but there are many, many more. But, that is a sort of growth that you see with him over the course of these films, and also his relationship to his parents and his relationship with sort of justice, like those are evolving over the course of these films. And obviously the first time we see him, at least as an adult, he's in the earliest part of the story, he's trying to kill his parents at the courthouse. And, by the end, he's, refusing to, basically kill anyone, even the sort of vile person you can think of. And so like that, to me, like that person's journey is definitely the most interesting part of the story.
Yeah, he certainly evolves, and seems like Nolan's able to pull specific things out of each film to develop Wayne and develop Batman, and the balance between the two of them. How much does Bruce need Batman? How much can Bruce lead a normal life or go back and get over the trauma of his parents' death? And ultimately, that seems to be what he must have had in mind when he was talking about this three films that him and Goyer kind of outlined originally. They must have been thinking broad strokes about how to do that. I do think it is interesting, Pat, though, because this film is a thriller. Like when you phrase it like that, it's like has checks every box for a crime thriller. I do feel, and I don't know, I think it's a really good one because they raise the stakes and they present the Joker as such a wild card that you honestly don't know what he is capable of and where the film's ultimately gonna land. And I think another part of that is the scope and scale of it compared to maybe a Marvel movie or even a Star Wars, where it's not like the whole planet is going to die in this film if he doesn't save the world or stop the bomb, which is what happens in Dark Knight Rises, but we'll talk about that next. It's more, there's two ships of people that potentially could die and the city could plunge into chaos and conceptions of justice and structure and society could crumble. But it's not as if there's like this huge global threat that all of a sudden needs to be dealt with that he is going to single-handedly take down. And I think that also helps with the climax of the film being as thrilling as it is it seems conceptually like something that has some basis in like something like a reality. So I think that certainly raises the stakes. Let's round this out with a little talk about Dark Knight Rises. Pat, I'll let you kick it off. You had a couple good points here.
Yeah, so this is the longest of the Dark Knight films. They get 15 minutes longer. The first is 2 hours and 15 minutes. The Dark Knight is 2 hours and 30 minutes. And this movie is a whopping 2 hours and 45 minutes. Does it hold your guys' attention for that whole time? Or is that like a long time to spend in this world with these characters?
JB, what do you think about that?
Well, by the time you get to Dark Knight Rises, your expectations are so high because of the prior two movies that any little sort of chink in the armor is going to seem like it's a negative. But upon rewatch, I found I really actually enjoyed some of even those slower moments because I respect the fact that Nolan was willing to take some time to again, as you talked about at the beginning of his process here, he wanted to make sure that his actors had spots for them to act. So it wasn't just like react to everything that's going on around them. Basically, there was obviously conversations and dialogue about things that probably are fairly realistic, even in dire circumstances. People would be having some of these, talking about these things. And, a big part of these films is in fact the journey of not only the Bruce Wayne character, but the journey of the people around Bruce Wayne. The constants are Lucius Fox and Alfred and Jim Gordon. And, unlike perhaps other films where there's one central hero and everybody else is clearly in a support role and supplemental and almost submissive, Bruce Wayne and Batman, there's a reason why the whole thing in Dark Knight Rises, when he has this basically separation with Alfred, is so heartbreaking. As an audience, you're watching it and you can't believe this is going to happen. You can't believe Bruce is going to be so stupid to let Alfred go. And Alfred's at his wit's end. It's like the last thing he wants to do is abandon this young man because literally his father basically said, "You're responsible for my son if anything happens to me." And it kills him. It literally kills Alfred to have to break off like that. But as he says, he goes, the only thing I think I can do is basically, this is it. It's the only thing I can do to convince you that the road you're going down is so treacherous that you're not going to come back from it. And I think then that also informs Bruce's decision to let Harvey at that press conference step forward and let him say he's Batman, because I think Bruce is paying attention to what Alfred said. And he's like, you know what? I might be able to have a chance with Rachel now if I drop off. Now, of course, he doesn't realize the depth of Rachel's relationship with Harvey, which is ironic. And then, of course, you got this, obviously, we got this Dark Knight Rises, we have the Bane character, which is this, blast furnace.
Hello, Batman.
People of Gotham. Take back your city.
Take back your city.
And is wearing high heel shoes so he can stand up to Batman, who's 6 feet tall.
Okay, can we talk about that? Let's just have an aside here. Tom Hardy is 5'9". Okay, I'm not knocking anybody for being short, but this man's supposed to be the most intimidating, like, physical villain in the Batman universe, and he was standing on apple boxes or apple crates every time that they had to film him across from another actor. I mean, it's just you literally could have gotten You could have gotten half Thor there, who just deadlifted 1,000+ pounds and then just dubbed in Tom Hardy's voice. There's like not really any acting except a little eye acting at the end. I don't understand.
His voice is all ADR anyway.
It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous that they didn't get a physical presence, and Tom Hardy got like the best paycheck in the world for basically just walking around with a mask on his face for a couple months. I'm sorry.
What's your point?
No, but to the point about the runtime. And Dan can comment on this. There certainly looks like there could be more trimmed. And Nolan was just like, clearly he really liked that metaphor of climbing out of a hole in the ground, of coming back from the dead, the resurrection. And he managed to milk almost like an hour and 20 minutes out of that somehow.
Way too much time. Way too much time.
He has, I didn't realize, I was like, oh, he probably has like 2 attempts at the wall. It's like, he has like 4 attempts climbing up that wall. Like, okay, I get it. I will say by the end of the film, though, I was.
Am I meant to understand all that? I just wanted you to know how difficult it was.
Oh my God, it's solid. There's parts of it that are solid, and we'll talk. Anne Hathaway, I can take her leave, but it's like they wrote that role to be.
I like your new girlfriend, Mr. Wayne.
Oh my God, but I guess it just doesn't seem as well put together as the other movies. There seems to be a lot that could be lost here, and I wouldn't be that upset.
Yep.
And to your point, I like the one where you said the Joseph Gordon-Levitt character, Pat. You had a note about that.
Yes. I don't know how many of our viewers have seen Batman versus Superman. I'm not going to spoil that movie for you right now because it's not very good. But at one point, Batman and Superman decide not to kill each other because both their moms are named Martha. And it's from the same person. So David S. Goyer was involved in both of these. And I mean, obviously when this movie came out in 2012, that hadn't happened yet, but Joseph Gordon-Levitt's character, whose legal name is Robin somehow, he knows that Bruce Wayne is Batman because he saw him at the orphanage where he grew up, and he could just tell that he was angry. And it's like, oh my God, this is Martha. Both our mothers are named Martha before, several years in advance. So that doesn't like that. I don't know. I mean, you have to. It's fine, I guess.
Right.
It moves that character forward, but it's kind of.
It's a little clunky. A lot of clunky moment.
Yeah.
Now, Dan, you said this. Yeah, you said this is the last like franchise movie that you really saw in like a theater setting. Did you think it was a strong ending? Is that why you stopped seeing him, or were you just like, if they can't land this quite right, I'm not so sure about anything else?
No, I don't think it was a conscious sort of reaction to the third one. I think I just was never really. I just don't think any of the other ones really were appealing to me. To be honest, when I saw them promoted or when I saw sort of the trailers or whatever, I was like, I'm never really on board with this. I didn't really care for the Dark Knight Rises, but it wasn't like I swore them all off after that disappointment.
Okay, I wasn't sure if it was like just a guttural reaction, like they didn't land this, and now I'm upset.
I think I actually I didn't know. I saw one franchise film. I saw the Wonder Woman film, which was good, but also had a lot of my sort of complaints, which is that like the action scenes last forever, and there's sort of like, it's like a cutaway scene almost where it's like, all right, here's all the action. And, it's going to be sort of like Mortal Kombat in a video game where it just sort of takes place in this like flat one-dimensional world. And then we'll go back to the story to sort of get through that. But anyways, I haven't been a huge fan of most of the other franchises.
Yeah, so I think we're in agreement that Rises was good. I think there's a good emotional impact at the end. At least I had that reaction again when they light that fire and the bat symbol goes up. I got to admit, I get pretty fired up. And then Nolan's constant cross-cutting again in the third act with going between them following the fight at City Hall, and then the bridge getting blown up with Joseph Gordon-Levitt taking the kids off the bus. I was like, that still is very effective. Technically, it's very well done. All right, we talked about some of the macro stuff as we talked about the micro. Let's skip down to let's go to technical, and then let's talk Nolan. So one thing we talked about with Inception the other week was how much Nolan likes practical effects. JB, what do you think this sort of use of practical effects here reflected in the budget? Because we just mentioned each one gets 15 minutes longer and costs about $50 million more. So that's the cost of 15 minutes in the Batman universe is $50 million. What do you think the practical effects adds to these films?
I think it gives it, not to be trite, I think it gives it a sense of more realistic scenarios playing out on these screens, even though we're in these, somewhat hyper reality worlds. The look of Gotham, particularly in Dark Knight Rises, it looks like a legitimate metropolitan area, and I think you really have a sense that people are in actual places that you're watching on the screen. I'm not sitting there going, they're not on a boat, they're not in a car, they're not in, it's like it seems like you're just watching these things unveil in front of you as if you're watching a documentary or a news reel, as opposed to something that's green screened or trumped up on a computer somewhere.
Yeah, Pat, do you feel the same way?
Yeah, I think these movies are tremendously effective because of their commitment to practical effects, but like also the way that they use the cities that they shoot in as real characters. And I think that one of the things that I like least about The Dark Knight Rises is that in Batman Begins and The Dark Knight, Gotham City's sort of real world stand-in is Chicago, which has a beautiful architecture and these wonderful sort of mid-century sort of semi-Gothic buildings that they use, plus the rivers and, I don't know if there are elevated, Dan, are there elevated roadways like that? I guess there are in Chicago.
Elevated what?
Roadways like in Gotham in Chicago? Or is that something made up?
Oh. No. Yeah. That's, you mean just like, yes, that's what you're saying.
Yeah, that's realistic Chicago. Yeah.
And I think it loses something when they switch to Pittsburgh, even though they're using New York for some bits of it. But they switched to Pittsburgh for The Dark Knight Rises, and I think something is really, I don't know, the world feels very physical and real to me in the first two, and like has a tangible shape to it, whereas The Dark Knight Rises feels like fuzzier on the edges and I don't know, less like Gotham to me.
I think I was gonna say, I think part of it is I feel like there's a lot of daytime in Dark Knight Rises, with them following the vehicles.
Yes. Right.
And I think that gets it out of the noir feel a lot, because that's one thing that, Rises is so much night. There's hospital sequence during the day. There's a couple things with Bruce Wayne and a couple surface street car chases, but it does. That certainly feels different, especially in the middle, probably hour and a half where, Bane appears and takes over the city, and all of a sudden it becomes winter and time gets compressed weirdly at the end. They just like go from 5 months to 2 days to 5 minutes. So that all happens pretty quickly. I will say, Lee Smith, the editor too, JB mentioned this at the top of the show, has worked with Nolan. He also, I believe, he got nominated for an Academy Award for editing this past year for not editing 1917. I will say he did a great job cross-cutting in all of these films, because Nolan seems to like that structure of just going back and forth between two things and doing that. Oh God, we talked about it before, the thing to make the tension rise that he does in Dunkirk too, where he changes the time frames and whatever. So I thought the editing was pretty solid here. One thing we haven't mentioned was music. which is, I didn't even put it on our notes, but where is this on superhero scores for you guys? I know JB and Pat are probably, I'll go to you guys because you probably enjoy them the most. JB?
Yeah, it's not even close. I mean, this is the best. I mean, it's just, Hammer is just, I mean, these are like a tour de force, these three films. I mean, it's a character in and of itself, and it's right on pitch. And I don't think there's a false, sometimes these things can get a little bit like the background music all of a sudden gets loud and you think like, wait a minute, I want to try to hear people talking. I had none of that reaction. It's like, it just seems like it fits perfectly. And I think it's a credit to, his ability to continue to just, Zimmer, I said Hammer, Zimmer, sorry.
Yeah, I was thinking MC Hammer.
Yeah, no, Zimmer, Hans Zimmer. It's just terrific. I think it's a tour de force for him.
Pat?
Yeah, I think it's pretty good. I don't know. It's probably sort of top middle for me in terms of superhero scores. And it's interesting because you can really see Hans Zimmer here. You can see the evolution from like the stuff that he was doing in the early 2000s with like the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, which are fairly traditional orchestral scores which have like the intrusion of more of this electronic sound that really comes out and comes to dominate in Batman, and then Hatchet sort of fully formed in Inception. And then, has become sort of a norm over the past 10 years. So I think it's a great score, and it's like definitely the movie is different without it. It's just not my personal like favorite score type.
Yeah, I noted in Dark Knight, I didn't realize it, but every time the Joker's on screen, they do that. I don't know what you'd call it, but that tone where it's like that sort of
it's like a string tone.
Yeah, that string tone.
Like
that plays throughout the whole sequence of the robbery,
Right. I mean, every time the Joker's on screen, they use that as a leitmotif to basically set the stage for build the tension there.
I think maybe, I think we spend a couple of just minutes about Heath Ledger's performance, because obviously he got the Oscar posthumously and obviously had to go to a dark place to come up with a characterization, and whether that contributed to his untimely and tragic death, who knows? But, since we recently got to see Joker, the movie with Phoenix, and again, different versions of the character, but I think it makes me appreciate Heath Ledger's performance all the more based on what he pulled off in Dark Knight.
Yeah, I don't know. I wasn't quite, maybe it's just because it's been talked about a million ways. I think his work in Brokeback Mountain is actually better than what he does on screen here, but I mean, maybe I'm just being contrarian. I don't know. Do you guys, Dan or Pat, do you have a thought about that?
Well, I definitely remember being wowed by it when I saw it. I was like, I was not very thoughtful when it came to films, and I sort of thought all actors were the same, but I definitely remember seeing them being very impressed and being, oh wow, this is like a memorable performance. I was in high school, so I didn't have a lot to draw on. And then as time goes on, it's hard to separate what is like a really good performance from what is, a sad and also sort of thematically aligned story with, this actor and the character he played. So I don't know. I'm still impressed by it, but I have a hard time comparing performances just because they all seem extremely unique to me. So I could defer to Pat on this. like I defer to Pat on pretty much any question you throw to me.
I think he's tremendously. I don't know. There's not much that I could say that hasn't been said. I wrote down in my notes that the Joker is legitimately terrifying. Like he is probably the only superhero villain that has any sort of real powerful dread, in the way that villains of other, maybe more character focused motion pictures will stick with you. So I think it's still a very, very effective performance all these years on.
Yeah. Okay. I think part of it's just how large that performance seems to loom. I think I just like to take the opposite end of the argument. Not saying it's not great. I don't know if it's this mythic thing that everybody makes it out to be, but then maybe that's just me. Okay. Let's just do this. Let's go through everybody's favorite film of the three, and then favorite performance, and then we'll do like an over-under here. So I'll start with me, and then we'll go Pat, Dan, JB. My favorite film of the three, I think, still holds as Dark Knight. I think the other two actually are a lot closer than I remember them being. But I would still go favorite film would be Dark Knight. And then I think favorite performance, I think Michael Caine does a lot of good work in Dark Knight and Dark Knight Rises before he disappears for half the film. So I like that. I like that performance of an old Michael Caine and then a crying Michael Caine. Pat?
My favorite film is also The Dark Knight, which is just both from my emotional attachment to it, and then I think as a film is the best by far, head and shoulders sort of above the other. Well, maybe not above Batman Begins. I think Batman Begins is also super enjoyable and good, whereas The Dark Knight Rises is, I can sort of take or leave. So The Dark Knight is definitely my favorite, I think, of these. I think really really did something special and different with this film, with genre and with these characters and these performances. And then my favorite, are we going to do scenes? Sorry.
Yeah, you can mention a scene too.
I thought that in the Batman Begins, the Tumbler chase, the first chase of the police chasing the Batmobile, I thought, wow, this is like way more thrilling than I remember it being, and like a much better sort of action set piece than I remember from this movie. So that was really nice. I like that. There are better scenes, but that was one that stuck out to me. And then my favorite performance is Gary Oldman. I'm sorry, JB, I might be stealing that one from you because I know he's a fave, but I think Gary Oldman does like some of the most interesting work, and like James Gordon is one of the more complex characters. He loses his family, at the end between the second and third films, and he's wandered in from like a more pure crime movie where he's dealing with crooked cops and he's a good detective. So I think he's the most interesting character outside of, I guess, Batman, and a great, just typically great performance from Gary Oldman.
Yeah, that's a good shout out. Dan?
I would probably say Batman Begins, largely due to an emotional attachment. I mean, I sticks out of the film that I just was wowed by visually. I can still very vividly remember being in the theater, seeing that the training sequence that takes place, on that sort of ice patch or whatever. And yeah, I think it just left an impression on me, and that's probably why it's my favorite. And then I was going to say both. I was tied between Michael Caine's performance and Gary Oldman, so I will sort of leave it at what you guys have already said, but I think those are probably my two favorites. And across all of the films, they're like consistently my favorite.
As much as I love Dark Knight, apropos of what I said in the pre-show, so to speak, if they don't do such a great job with Batman Begins, there is no Dark Knight. There is no opportunity to play out the Heath Ledger Joker story, and we don't get the trilogy if he doesn't get off to a tremendous start in Batman Begins. So, and there's so many lines, there's so many sequences in Batman Begins that are just so, you could take different things from different parts of it, and because of the themes that are touched on and what have you. In terms of scenes, there's so many, but I would say that I love the scene where Bruce is in the Batcave and stumbles in, and all of a sudden the bats are around, and he stands up, and they show the bats swirling around him, and he just stands up, and the music from Zimmer starts to rise, and basically here he is facing his fears. And his father not only had said, why do we fall? But so we can learn to pick ourselves back up. But he says, you know why they attacked you, don't you? They were afraid of you. You always are afraid of what you don't understand. So in terms of performances, obviously Christian Bale's terrific, but I really like Morgan Freeman in these movies. I really think that he's a nice counterweight to Bruce Wayne, and plays a valuable role in his life. And there's a big thing here about mentorship, and it's not banged over your head, but the reality is that even the most successful people who are wealthy, people with all sorts of resources, just like the rest of us, you do need people in your life that you can count on, that will talk to you straight and give you real advice and won't tell you what you want to hear all the time. And I think that's I think there's a value in that type of relationship.
Lucius is a very good character, and I'd never thought about the mentoring relationship, but it's a good point. There's so much jam packed into these films. Last question on the favorites before we talk about Nolan is I pulled 2 scores for the series, and I averaged them just because that was the easiest thing to do. So the average on Metacritic was 77, and the average on IMDb was an 85. So I'm going to pose to you guys, you can either go under both of them. So that would be below a 77. You can go in between, which means between a 77 and an 85, or you can go over both of them, and that'd be 85 and above. So I'll say under, split, or over. And I'm going to go.
This is for all 3.
For all 3 on average. So I'm going to split. So I'm going to be between a 77 and an 85. Pat, what do you think?
I'm also split.
All right, so you're in the same range, 77 to 85. Dan?
I'll go on a limb and I'll say above. The only superhero franchise I've completed, so therefore it's got to be with something.
JB?
I'm not sure how this fits into what you just said because I wasn't really listening, but I think the 85 is my number for if I had to pick a number for the 3.
So you're pushing and splitting. You're split pushing.
I'm not sure what that means, but I like the 85 number as the overall rating from
I see. So you're with the fanboys on IMDb, the Christopher Nolan fan club over there on IMDb.
No, I'm with the thoughtful reviewers of cinema that have said 85.
Okay. All right. Speaking of Christopher Nolan, I talked a little bit about. We've watched now 4 of his movies and talked about them. I'm interested to know if you guys have any comps on what Nolan is to this era. I mean, is he a Spielberg? Is he a Hitchcock? Is he what is he? Is he something totally new? Anybody have any thoughts on that?
He's rich, is what he is. I'll tell you that much.
I would think so.
I mean, I think everybody's just set up. I mean, I would say that there's signs that he's a combo of Spielberg and Hitchcock. I mean, those are 2 pretty good examples. I mean, I think he's got the seriousness, the thoughtfulness of a very good writer, Hitchcockian, and then he's got enough commercial sense and sense of spectacle and vision that he knows that, if you really want to keep doing what you got to do, you got to make money for the studios. And Spielberg obviously has probably the best of that in history of film. So, to me, if I had to pick 2 guys, the ones you just mentioned are pretty, not really too bad in terms of measuring up from, what Nolan's contribution's been like in the last 20 years or 18 years, however long he's doing it now.
He's also cited Kubrick. Dan or Pat, do you guys see any of that in there, or is there any other director that he brings to mind?
Yeah, I think there's he's equal parts Kubrick. He's inheriting a legacy. And a style and both style and structure, and then even as filmic touchstones, Spielberg and Hitchcock and Kubrick, like those 3 are very clearly at times, he's emulating one or the other of those great filmmakers. I just, I know I feel like this has been said a lot, and I don't know to the extent that it's true, but like I feel like he doesn't connect emotionally. He's very, very logical. And like a lot of his movies do not, ironically, Dunkirk, I think, was one of the better ones, and emotionally, and I think The Prestige as well. Like they don't connect emotion. They don't have the emotional warmth of a Spielberg film. They don't have the humor and the playfulness necessarily of the Hitchcock film. And yes, Stanley Kubrick was also cold and interested more in societies and systems rather than individual people. But like he's still, I don't know, still warmer than Christopher Nolan to me.
Huh. Interesting. Dan, do you have any other thoughts on sort of Nolan's tone or other directors?
No, I was just really thinking about what Pat was saying, and I'm interested in that. I'm not sure I would agree, but I want to. I mean, I will probably be thinking about that the rest of the day, whether he lacks the warmth of even like measuring up to Kubrick. I think my gut says I disagree, but I actually can't really back it up. So I'm going to stay silent for now.
No, I thought it was really interesting. To what you just said, Pat, is this idea of what is cinema and what's its, what is the purest form. I think when I think Steven Spielberg, or I think Alfred Hitchcock, or I think Stanley Kubrick, I think cinema. When I think Christopher Nolan, I think storyteller. Like I think his stories could be presented in other mediums and be nearly as effective. I think where he plays with form is not necessarily in the actual cinematic structure in terms of visuals, presentation, juxtaposition of images, or film grammar. It's more in the writing process and how he's presenting it there, which is no knock against him. He's probably one of the top, absolutely one of the top 5 writers, and clearly he has some type of vision. I also don't think if he's codified a visual style, but I think a lot of that might be down to his collaborations with cinematographers. I think there's directors that can change cinematographers and keep a consistent sort of feel to their work, like Paul Thomas Anderson's done. But yeah, I think I was wondering, is he like an actual auteur? Because when I think Quentin Tarantino, he's playing notes from different genres, he's mashing them up. And yeah, he's writing the stuff and he's directing it, but I don't think anybody else could direct a Quentin Tarantino script as well as he could, which I guess you could argue against that because, you have True Romance, which is a pretty damn good adaptation of whatever Quentin's script originally was. I don't know how much that changed from script to screen. But I think you could find a good number of directors that could make a Nolan movie and maybe even make a better version of a Nolan script. I don't know if anybody else has thoughts on that, but the more I thought about it, I was like, his strength is so much in the writing that I'm not sure that he's as cinematic as he sort of claims to be. I don't know. This is controversial.
No, that's an interesting way to put it. That the man who's one of the men who's like literally saving the shooting of film on film. And like clearly an image obsessive, like, is that his actual weak point? I don't know. That's interesting.
I don't know. There's certain things in his movies that just, I can't quite put my finger on it again, but, it may be part of it's the warmth factor. I think there's certainly emotion in his films. But you're right. Sometimes it comes across as almost
there's a lot of humor,
mechanical.
a lot of humor in these films. Batman Begins in particular, lots of lines back and forth that comes out of the characters knowing each other. In terms of the discussion about whether somebody else could direct his movies better than he could, well, first of all, I'm not sure that it matters all that much because he's directed them and he's written them and produced them and managed to get outstanding actors to want to be in his movies, and he makes a lot of money for the studio, and he gets critical acclaim with almost everything he does.
I would like to see him to direct a script he hasn't written. I think that would be actually a really good test of his
when Daniel
style.
gets something written, we'll call up Chris because I got his personal cell, and I'll say, look, Dan's ready for this particular thing. It's like Inception meets Interstellar meets Dunkirk, and very exciting. And we'd love Chris for you to take a look at it and see what we can do with it. So.
Yeah. He's box office. I guess that's what matters.
But again, look at the quality of people that want to work with the guy. Actors know directors, right? If there's some flaw that maybe he's not as good as advertised, I don't know. Some of these people are signing up and I don't think they're getting top dollar to be in his movies. They might have a piece of the action at the back end, but
I think Dan talked earlier about, somebody mentioned something about performance in these films, and there is good performance, but, in measuring performances across films and comparing them, he's certainly not a director's actor, though, or an actor's director. Sorry, because there's certain people that you can see really draw it out, and there's certain people that shoot a lot in close up and intentionally do things to help sort of promote and boost a performance on screen. I don't think Nolan does that. He pretty much sticks to his guns in terms of whatever's on the storyboard is kind of the impact of the shot that he wants. He's not necessarily going in for maybe the emotional impact that some directors would do with close-ups and medium closes and things like that.
Well, yeah, I think that's like, I was going to say, I think that's one of the risks I always hear people talk about when the writer is also the director, is the fear that it's going to be a little too married to the script rather than sort of discovering stuff in the moment, because you're a little bit more precious when it's your writing, and maybe that's what's going on there. It's like some directors who are also writers, like Tarantino, maybe is a bit better at letting it breathe when they're on set and actually filming.
Yeah, that's true. That's very true in terms of just letting the moment. Maybe they're just more comfortable being like more of a director than sort of an orchestrator. So like you said, because they have the story that they've held on to this long. Nolan's development's interesting though. JB touched on this earlier, so I'm just going to mention it again. But this is like he got a huge jump up here from Insomnia to this film and this series. It's incredible how that blew open the doors for him to do original tentpole films that are all based off of his own ideas, his own writing, his own directing. And then I think the final thing was we had a question here about best trilogies of all time. I think why don't we do that and then we'll get out of here. So where does this power rank on people's sort of trilogy list? JB, why don't you start with yours? You got a whole bunch.
Well, yeah, I proffer this more as a question because it's it's difficult really how you truly define trilogies in movies because there's been movies that have series that have gone beyond 3. So if you took the first 3 and called it a trilogy, so the 3 that comparables that I come up with that I think are fair comps are arguably the Man with No Name, the Leone spaghetti westerns with Clint. Even though he's not exactly the same character, basically he is the same character with a different no name that he, the 3 movies, and many of the same actors are in these films with him. Even though, much like Pat has an issue with the 4th Raiders of the Lost Ark movie, Raiders of the Lost Ark, and Godfather, I don't really officially recognize Godfather 3, but yet it truly is a trilogy of 3 films. So yeah, you have to say that is a trilogy, the Godfather movies. I'm calling Raiders a trilogy because I'm going to acquiesce to Pat and say, okay, fine, the last one doesn't count, so there's 3 of those. Star Wars, the original cast, the first for those 1, 2, and 3. And then there's been thrown in here: Toy Story, Lord of the Rings, John Wick, most recently. They're going to quickly crank out a 4th, but right now it's 3. And then, I'd almost forgotten about this one, Smokey and the Bandit, with Burt Reynolds and Jerry Reed and Jackie Gleason was in a couple.
The 70s were so weird. Elliot Gould and Burt Reynolds were the biggest stars in the world.
And, I looked it up. The box office for Smokey and the Bandit 1 in 1977 was $300 million, which is akin to $1.2 billion today.
Okay, wow.
So,
70s.
Yeah, so
70s for a wild time.
And then the other ones that I said sort of near qualify in my book are the Bourne movies because there were the first 3, and then there was a big gap with 4. Rocky 2 and 3.
I would swap 3 for 4. I'd do 1, 2, and 4.
Well, I don't know if you have to have it in chronological order in order to.
You can pick and choose, like a pick and choose 6-pack. I'd do Rocky 1, 3, and 4 probably.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that.
Be okay with that.
And then Dirty Harry, the first 3 Dirty Harry movies are I think are a fair trilogy. And of course, in sports, the only one that matters is Ali versus Frazier. So those are kind of my comps in terms of I think what you're picking against because there's very few true, pure trilogies, right?
I think Lord of the Rings is tops for me. I love like watching the extended version. Like I've never sat through those movies and been like, oh, I wish the time was more compressed. I'm like, I always leave wishing that I could spend more time.
There's just 3 of those, or were there more? Was there more?
There's 3, but then they did the Hobbit movies, which are sort of their own.
Oh, their own universe.
They don't exist. They exist with the 4th Indiana Jones movie.
That's a whole nother story, the way that thing went. But Lord of the Rings was a huge undertaking, absolutely gigantic, and an Academy Award winner. So I'd probably go.
I suppose how many Harry Potter movies were there? 6?
8? Because they split the last movie in half, I think. I don't know. 7 years plus one extra movie, and now there's another series.
I think it's 8.
I don't have anything else. I don't think there's anything else that you missed. Those are, it's certainly up there. It's up there. It's tough to do, man. It's so tough to do it across three films. And then you got the Avengers Marvel Universe Phase 1, which is 22 films that culminate in Avengers Endgame.
No. That's I think the 23 films is the Infinity Saga.
Okay.
Which is all of the phases. Get your nomenclature right there. RP.
Okay. I'll have to brush up, and I think Dan's going to volunteer to watch all 23 of those films. So he's filled back in on the superhero shit.
Oh, he's in quarantine. Why not?
All All right. Well, that about does it for talking the Dark Knight to death. I think we've done it every way, shape, and form. Dan, thank you for coming on. You're welcome to come on anytime at all.
Yeah, Dan, well, I'll be talking to your people since I'm going to be spinning off having my own show.
You can be a co-host.
JB and Dan. Something like
Thanks for
that.
having me.
Yeah. So
It's very, very enjoyable. I learned a lot. I really felt like I came in extremely unprepared compared to what you guys are bringing to the table. But I hope I was not too much of a time waster.
No, it was very enjoyable. And next time we'll limit it to one film that we talk about. And I think we're all getting a little tired of talking about 3 films because we've been doing this for a lot recently.
It's a lot of work.
So what I think we're going to do coming up is we're going to talk off air and we're going to continue with our Film Companion series. And we'll have announcements on next time we're on air on what we're going to be talking about coming forward. But we appreciate you guys listening. And until we talk to you next, we will
see you in the movies.